Okay, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning, a very good-looking group. I landed last night from Cleveland, and not where I live, I'll get into that in a second, but it's really a pleasure to spend the morning with all of you today. I've heard so much about your school, and it's really an honor to be here. Ultimately, we're here for one reason and one reason only today. Our ultimate goal as educators, of course, we have a lot of goals and a lot of things on our to-do list every single day that we're all drowning in with parents and grading and lesson planning and PD, everything we have to deal with. But ultimately, our goal is the physical and mental well-being of our students. And that's the reason we're here today. We're using a case study today speaking about Jewish students and anti-Semitism, but of course this applies to all of our students from every background. And we'll get to this a little bit later, but I believe in a previous PD session, you already were given a document from the OCDSB, which is a really excellent document that goes through how to respond to incidents of hate in the classroom and social media. We're going to get to that a little bit later, but it's already good to know that you have this tool at your disposal. So what are we going to do today? Mina mentioned this a little bit. In part one, our first section here in the auditorium, we're going to speak a little bit about anti-Semitism, what it is, how to identify it in the classroom. Whose fault is it, right? Seems like a controversial question. We'll get to that soon. Is criticizing Israel anti-Semitic? And how to respond to anti-Semitism. The second section, as Mina mentioned, we're going to go into the library, I believe, and we're going to go into small groups, and we're going to be given different case scenarios. And the idea there is to put our learning into practice. Think about what we've learned in the first half and what you've learned, throughout your professional development here and your own knowledge, and how you can apply it to different scenarios that you may have faced or you may face in the future in the classroom. And then, of course, we want to send you off today with helpful resources. We want to be really practical, so it's not just, yeah, it was an interesting talk this morning, but you want to walk out of today's session with actual tools in your pocket, with links, with videos, with resources that you can use both to educate yourself and that you can use in the classroom as well. Okay, so a little bit about me really briefly. My name is Avi Posen. I'm originally from Winnipeg. I now live, there's Winnipeg on the top left. Hands up if you've been to Winnipeg before. Nice, love it. I was actually just in South Africa, and every time I mentioned Winnipeg, no one had heard about it, so it's nice to be here again. I now live in Haifa, which is a city in northern Israel. It's a much better view than the Winnipeg view. And before living there, I worked at the Jewish Day School in Winnipeg for almost a decade, and I worked with university students, and I helped run a Jewish summer camp there, amongst other things. I now work for a company that's called Unpacked, or Unpacked for Educators, and we're a Jewish educational media company. We have hundreds of videos on YouTube, podcasts, articles, social media content, but most importantly, we have an educational website. There's a QR code. I see some of you know what you're doing, took your phone out right away to grab it. I'll show you this slide again later during the session. What we do is we create content about Jewish history, about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we give resources for free, discussion questions and learning activities, reflection questions, further learning links for free that educators around the world can take advantage of. So that's what I do. I create these resources and I work with Jewish educators and other educators from all over the world on bringing this content to their students, to have these meaningful conversations. I want to start off with this picture. So, special picture, especially to me. These are my three aunts and my grandfather, second from the left, who I call my Zeta Saul. They were named last year as the oldest living Holocaust survivor siblings in the world. My aunt Ruth on the far left is 96. My Zeta is turning 99 in a month. The far right is my Auntie Hania, Auntie Anne, who is 100. And the one in red, unfortunately, a month and a half ago passed away just before her 102nd birthday. So I've really had the pleasure, of learning about this topic, not just in an academic way, but in my own family at the dinner table from a young child until today. Thank God I continue to keep hearing these stories and learn the lessons that my grandparents, my grandmother is also a Holocaust survivor, have taught me. This is just an image that I just want to share. Back in 2013, I went with my Zeta Saul to his village in Poland where he was born. He hadn't been back in 73 years. It was a very emotional trip, obviously, in a lot of different ways. And interestingly enough, my wife's grandfather is from the same small town in Poland, and he was in the same class as my Zeta Saul. And this was a week before our first date, so that worked out well. So let's jump into things. If everyone could grab their phones out for a second. I want to start off with a fun little Mentimeter. Hands up if you've used Mentimeter in the classroom before. Okay, a couple of you. Mentimeter, assuming phones are allowed in class, are they here? Yeah, sometimes, depends on the teacher. So in cases where you have devices, phones or laptops, a great tool that you can use is Mentimeter, where, if you're talking about difficult subjects or controversial topics and you want everybody to be able to share what they're thinking, but kids don't always want to put up their hand and say what they're thinking, you can use things like Mentimeter that are anonymous and people can share their thoughts in that way, which is really great. So the first question is straightforward. How many Jews are there in the world? Okay, so in real time we're going to see what your responses are. They're coming in hot right now. Let's see. So we've got, that's a lot of zeros at the bottom, it's hard to count. 60 million, that looks like 200 million, 20 million, many, 88 million, 100 million, lots of guesses. We'll let them come in. Okay, great. I'm going to freeze it there. Okay, lots of guesses all over the place, right? Generally, pretty high numbers, right? We may hear about Jewish people in the media pretty often for a variety of reasons. So it seems like there's a lot of Jewish people in the world. The answer is there's actually only 15 million Jews in the entire world, which is an interesting point. So the next question, you don't have to do anything, stay on your phone in the same place. How many Jews are there in Canada? How many Jewish people are there in Canada? So send in your guesses. Let's see them in real time. Some. That is true. Some of them are in this room right now. Okay. 300,000, 20,000, 1 to 3 million. It's a smart group already because we've learned based on the previous question, right? Okay, I'm going to pause it there. We have less than 15 million, 500,000, 4 million, 3 million. The answer is 390,000. There's only 390,000 Jews in all of Canada, which is less than 1% of all Canadians. And most of them live in Toronto, Montreal, but there's other cities, Ottawa, Winnipeg, Vancouver, where there's smaller populations. But it's important to know these numbers before we go forward. So let's jump into the conversation today. I want to show you a few images that I've found, that I've seen myself on social media, most of them over the last couple of weeks. Some of them are a little bit older. But let's look at a couple of these images. And little caveat that these images are mostly American images, but we'll get to Canada in a second. On the top left here, neo-Nazis show up at Dallas Holocaust Museum on Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, which was last week, with anti-Semitic posters. America 2023, bomb threats at the following synagogues took place leading up to and over the Rosh Hashanah weekend, which is the Jewish New Year, which was 2 weeks ago. Right? You can see in a variety of different places. On the top right, this is in front of a synagogue in Georgia from last week. People came and held swastikas, Nazi flags right in front of a synagogue. On the bottom left, the San Diego rabbi was assaulted at a 7-Eleven and told all Jews need to die and Israel doesn't deserve to exist. Pink Floyd, great band, but Roger Waters, he's been in a lot of trouble lately because he has been spreading a lot of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Even at one of his concerts, he dressed up as an SS officer, as a Nazi officer. And during his concerts, he has big inflatable pigs that have Jewish stars on them. Very problematic things, right? At the bottom right, this is another image. from a school in California last week that kids actually posted on social media. It's not someone took a picture and said, oh my God, look what happened. Kids posted this on social media of them doing the Nazi salute. Very horrifying things, right? And of course, I threw in a little image there of Kanye West, if you were following the news this past year at all. Kanye West, famous for a lot of reasons. One of them is his anti-Semitism. I want to read a quote to you before we speak about Canada. Deborah Lipstadt, she's a famous academic and diplomat who, there's a great Netflix film about her story called Denial. She helped fight against anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. She's now working for the White House. She wrote a great book about anti-Semitism, which I'm going to reference later. But this is a quote that I want to read and sort of explain to you, just because today we're speaking really about the Jewish lived experience to understand where the mindset is for Jewish people, not just globally, but in Canada today too. So let's look at this quote. This is in regards to when looking for a synagogue, okay? When you get to the street that it's on, look out for the police with submachine guns. They're standing in front of the synagogue. But if you have trouble finding the street, just watch for men in baseball caps and follow them. They will lead you to the synagogue. So there's two things to unpack here. Number one is that synagogues, it's shocking, but also in Canada, of course in America. I was just recently, like I said, in South Africa. All over the world, synagogues have, in most cases, armed security. I was with a friend in New Jersey a couple months ago, picking his kid up from school, in elementary school, and every car that comes into the parking lot, armed guards come and they check for bombs under every single car. This is what's happening all over the world. But not only do synagogues need to be protected with armed security guards, but I want to point out the baseball cap part, because a lot of people, you'll see I'm wearing a kippah, which is the traditional head covering that Jewish men wear. A lot of people are afraid to wear these in public. They're afraid to wear them outside. And that's why the reference here is, if you look for baseball caps, you'll find the Jewish people, because they're afraid to actually dress the way they want to dress in public. They're afraid of what will happen. So just to understand that. So let's look at anti-Semitism in Canada. Here's, of course, some graffiti that was at the provincial court here in Ottawa. I found this picture online. But a couple of news clippings just from the last year or so. Right? Canadian Jews under attack, close to 50% rise in hate crimes towards Jews in 2021. 2021 was the most anti-Semitic year in the last decade. Canada's Jews say anti-Semites declared open season on them since Gaza conflict. Jewish communities on edge amid troubling rise of anti-Semitism in Canada. The dangerous rise in anti-Semitism in Canada that nobody's talking about. We're talking about it here. Canadian students give Nazi salute to Jewish teacher whose parents survived the Holocaust. Right? Really horrifying clippings that we see. Right? Hate crimes in Canada. These numbers are important. We mentioned at the beginning that Jews make up less than 1% of the Canadian population, but are the religious group in Canada most likely to be targeted for hate crimes. By the way, I want to say here that today's session is not about, victim Olympics, right? Saying, oh, we're such big victims. There's lots of groups that are victims of horrible discrimination and hate crime and racism, and that's what we're talking about. But today we're sharing, the story of the Jewish people, right? So Jews remain the most targeted religious group in Ottawa too. In 2021, Ottawa Police Service found that hate crime motivation against Jews increased by 60%, 2021. Police reported hate crimes targeting Jews were up 47%. Here are a couple images that were shared with me in Ottawa. This is at a park in Ottawa where a swastika was painted on a child's play structure. This was outside the Metro at Greenbank Square last year. I want to start off with this image. I referenced this earlier about students who were giving a Hitler salute or a Nazi salute to a Jewish teacher in class. It's really important here to understand, first of all, I think most of us in this room understand how horrible that is to begin with. But you have to understand from a Jewish perspective what this does, right? Canadian Jews in particular, if you were to ever, let's say you have Jewish students, you ask them, was your family victims of the Holocaust? The truth is probably half or more than half of your students either have grandparents or great-grandparents or relatives who were killed in the Holocaust or survived the Holocaust, meaning the story of the Holocaust isn't just something that we talk about in history books. It's something that's really a part of how Jewish people grow up. It's an intergenerational trauma. There's research on this, that this trauma is passed down through generation. The baseball caps, right? That's a prime example of it, that, taught to be proud Jewish people, but at the same time, there's a fear, there's a hesitancy to be who you are because of all this heavy-duty history. And when you see something like a Nazi salute in class, that's interpreted often as a direct attack against the people in your family, right? Great-grandparents that were murdered, aunts and uncles, right? I spoke about my family earlier. I can speak about both my grandparents, but just my Zeta Saul side, he had over 90 family members murdered in the Holocaust, all of his aunts and uncles, all of his cousins, his grandparents, right? Murdered for nothing, for being Jewish people. So when Jewish people see something like this, and any of those symbols, that's where it takes them back to. It's an attack on who they are. It's an attack on their family. It's an attack on their very existence. So ultimately, right, we need to continue to educate ourselves about these topics so that when things like this come up, we deal with it right away. We nip it in the bud, and we make sure that our students feel safe. Okay, so I'd like to start off. I mentioned that I work at a media company, so we make videos. I want to start off with this video. This is a question that a lot of people ask. Whose fault is anti-Semitism? Is it a problem only on the right? Is it a problem only on the left? Is it coming from a specific group? I'm going to show you this clip, which, by the way, you all have access to all of these videos and all the resources that come along with them, which I'll show you later on. But we're going to start with this video, Whose Fault is Anti-Semitism? And keep in mind that as we watch these videos, as I speak this morning, when we have a chance during the second half to debrief and unpack and reflect, keep in mind the thoughts that come to mind, the questions that come to mind, because we'll have an opportunity to have some back and forth. And of course, today's just a short session of a long PD day, but we want these conversations to continue. We want this to be the beginning of a conversation. 11 o'clock this morning isn't the end of it, it's really the beginning of it. So let's start with this video, Whose Fault is Anti-Semitism?
Whose fault is anti-Semitism? This is probably the most controversial question about anti-Jewish prejudice. Conservatives blame liberals, liberals blame conservatives, Christians blame Muslims, Muslims blame Christians. So who's right? Is there a specific community that drives anti-Semitism? The answer is no. That's because anti-Semitism has always been spread by offenders across the ideological spectrum. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering, declared the godfather of communism Karl Marx in 1843. What is his worldly god? Money. Not long after, Marx's contemporary Wilhelm Marr, the right-wing German nationalist who mainstreamed the term anti-Semitism, he was for it, declared that Jews didn't share the same sense of ethics as non-Jews because they preferred to accumulate wealth. Marx and Marr didn't agree on much, but they agreed on those self-serving, money-grubbing Jews. This anti-Semitic agreement didn't just hold among political rivals. For centuries, the Christian church persecuted Europe's Jews as Christ killers and infidels, while Voltaire, the Enlightenment's sharpest critic of the religious establishment, repeatedly assailed Judaism, calling Jews an ignorant, stupid people. These examples are just the tip of the anti-Semitic iceberg. Throughout history, people with entirely opposite worldviews, from Nazi Germany's Adolf Hitler to the Soviet Union's Joseph Stalin, have somehow found a way to agree on one thing: persecuting Jewish people. On the surface, this is pretty confusing, but it makes sense when you understand that anti-Semitism predates our modern categories and stems from something far more fundamental: the human inability to tolerate difference. Jews are the world's oldest minority that has refused to conform to the majority culture. For thousands of years, Jews have persisted in their unique practices and traditions. They were too stubbornly Jewish for religions like Christianity and Islam that sought to convert them. Too religious for atheists and free thinkers like Voltaire. Too closed off and clannish for the internationalist left like the communists of the Soviet Union who put Jews in gulags. And too worldly and widespread for the nationalist right, who slurred them as corrupt cosmopolitans undermining the state. As an ever-present minority, Jews have been perpetually scapegoated for the majority's problems, constantly cast as untrustworthy and accused of serving their own interests at the expense of society's. In the biblical book of Esther, the villain Haman tells the king, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." This 2,000-year-old expression of anti-Semitism could have been written yesterday. Take this recent broadcast by True News, a right-wing Christian news outlet that was accredited by the Trump White House.
That's the way the Jews work. They are deceivers. They plot, they lie, they do whatever they have to do to accomplish their political agenda.
Now listen to this 2015 interview with Jewish Senator Bernie Sanders by Diane Rehm on NPR, the polar opposite of True News. You'll recognize some familiar themes.
Senator, you have dual citizenship with Israel.
Well, no, I do not have dual citizenship with Israel. I'm an American. I don't know where that question came from. No, I'm an American citizen, period.
Jews sought to escape their minority status by founding their own state, Israel. But now anti-Semites just accuse Jews everywhere, like Sanders, of disloyally working for Israel as part of a global conspiracy to control non-Jewish countries. These insinuations find their way from the internet into everyday interactions.
Mr. Carleton looks like a regular white guy, nice guy, whatever, but in actuality, he's a Jewish white guy. And if the public was informed of that by C-SPAN, I think they would take his comments differently. Because this guy is Jewish, that means that he is concerned about Israel.
Eric, I want to give the congressman a chance to respond to that.
I normally am pretty tolerant to people who ask questions, but I'm not to your assumption. I take great offense to that. This country, our loyalty is to America. Our concerns are to America.
As they have throughout history, conspiracy theories about Jews undermining society have deadly consequences. In 2018, a white supremacist named Robert Bowers, who claimed Jews were scheming to replace whites with brown immigrants, massacred 11 worshippers in a Pittsburgh synagogue. In the years that followed, another white nationalist attacked a synagogue in California, while black extremists with entirely different worldviews shot up a kosher supermarket in New Jersey and stabbed religious Jews at a Hanukkah gathering in New York. The point here is not that anti-Semitism exists equally in all these communities. It's that no community is immune to anti-Semitism because no community is immune to the instinct to stigmatize difference. Nowhere is this more apparent than Europe, where Jews surveyed from Spain to Sweden report experiencing serious anti-Semitism from all directions. This testimony reflects real-world bigotry. Whether it's Poland's Christian Conservative Party passing laws to repress studying the Holocaust and Polish complicity in it, or Hungary's nationalist leaders leading a state-sponsored campaign demonizing Jewish financier George Soros, blaming him for the country's problems and comparing him to Hitler, or Britain's preeminent left-wing party failing to stop pervasive anti-Semitism in its ranks under leader Jeremy Corbyn, or Jews in France being subjected to countless violent attacks at the hands of Islamic extremists. As you can see, anti-Semitism is the ultimate equal opportunity offender. So why does anti-Semitism continue to flourish across the spectrum? The answer is simple. People only tend to police anti-Jewish bigotry when it comes from the other side, not their own. It's understandable why this happens. After all, it's much easier to condemn the prejudice of people you already despise and disagree with. It's a lot harder to speak up when the bigotry is coming from your friends and allies. But think about it. Where do you have the power to make change? Among your friends or among your enemies? In your community or in someone else's? Yet too often, our national conversation about anti-Semitism consists of people trying to bounce anti-Semites from parties they weren't invited to. Conservatives policing progressive anti-Semitism, progressives policing conservative anti-Semitism, and so on. You don't have to be an expert in anti-Semitism to see why this doesn't work. So how can we stop this from happening and start fighting the anti-Semites instead of each other? The secret is this. Focus on the anti-Semitic ideas expressed, not the individual expressing them. If we train ourselves to recognize anti-Jewish sentiments, rather than getting distracted by their source, we'll be much more successful at identifying and uprooting the hateful ideas across the board. But if we pick and choose which anti-Semitism to care about based on who says it, and give our own community a pass, the bigotry will continue to spread unchecked. Because the truth is, casting anti-Jewish prejudice as a specifically left-wing problem, or right-wing problem, or Christian problem, or Muslim problem, is really just a way of saying that it's someone else's problem. The only people who win this argument over who's the bigger bigot are the anti-Semites, who continue to spread their hate while their supposed opponents point fingers at each other. To truly combat anti-Semitism, we need to stop thinking of it as other people's problem and start confronting it as our problem.
Okay, great. So the message there, I hope, is clear, that when we're speaking about anti-Semitism and Jew hatred, we're not talking about a specific group, we're talking about the ideas. And it's important, it's incumbent upon us as educators to understand those ideas, to understand the conspiracy theories so that we can, educate ourselves, educate our students, and create a safer space. So again, we've already spoken about anti-Semitism today, but we haven't actually done a bit of a deep dive on what that is. We know in the most broad of terms it is hatred of Jews, Jew hatred, right? But let's actually look at a definition of anti-Semitism. Okay, this is from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. This is the definition of anti-Semitism that is accepted by Canada, accepted by the USA, by the EU, by the province of Ontario. And let's go through this because this is helpful. And again, I want to clarify that the purpose of today's conversation is not to label things anti-Semitic, to not label people anti-Semitic, but it's to understand when things are hurtful and hateful and offensive and how that impacts our students. We're not in the business here of labeling people this or that. We're in the business of keeping our students safe. So let's do that. And this is a helpful tool in doing so. So anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So let's look at a couple examples. It's important. Sometimes, it feels tedious, but it's important to go through actual examples of how this manifests itself. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm going to go through some of them. Calling or aiding or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. Making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews as such, or the power of Jews as a collective, such as especially, but not exclusively, the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy, or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. I'll read one more here. Accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, or even for acts committed by non-Jews. This is a good example. Yes, of course, it applies to anti-Semitism, but it applies to every group. To not blame one person or one small group to paint a whole community with a wide brush. Here are a couple other examples here. And this was brought up in the video that we just watched, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide and to the interests of their own nations. We saw that example in the video, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, right? The one Jewish country in the world, the state of Israel, right? Claiming that that in itself is racist. Of course, that's problematic. Applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. And finally, and this one I think we're going to come back to here, is holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel. Regardless of where they live, regardless of their age, we understand that point, of course. So one more video that we're going to watch today. It will show up in a moment, don't worry. It relates directly to what I just mentioned about the connection to Israel, right? Often there's a debate in society if criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic. I'll give you a spoiler alert, it's not. A lot of people criticize Israel like we criticize any country. Canadians criticize Canada, Americans criticize America. People can criticize whatever country they want for whatever reason they want. The issue is when that crosses the line into hatred, when that crosses the line into anti-Semitism, then it's not okay. So I want to show you the next video, which is the final video, and then we're going to continue to speak about the question of, is criticizing Israel anti-Semitic?
Is criticizing Israel anti-Semitic? It's a question that confuses many well-meaning people. Some assume that an attack on the Jewish state must also be an attack on Jews. For instance, evangelical leader Franklin Graham once dubbed criticism of Israeli settlers an assault on God's chosen people. At the same time, others justify their attacks on Jewish people around the world by pointing to Israel's actions, claiming that they are only being anti-Zionist, not anti-Semitic. So what's the deal? Is criticizing the Jewish state anti-Jewish? Not quite. In fact, it happens all the time in Israel itself and among Jews everywhere. Just as someone can oppose the policies of the United States, France, China, or Saudi Arabia, they can oppose the actions of the Israeli government. Doing so doesn't make them a bigot. Objections to Israeli domestic policies, settlements, occupation, or treatment of the Palestinians are political positions, not anti-Semitic slurs. This is true even when the criticism is harsh, controversial, or makes some people uncomfortable. Israel is a country like any other, and it deserves criticism like any other. If that were the end of the conversation, it would make our lives a lot easier. But unfortunately, it's not. That's because criticism of the Jewish state sometimes masks animosity towards Jews, and as a result, anti-Israel movements often attract anti-Jewish bigots. Just look at the website antizionism.org, which is actually run by neo-Nazi white supremacists. This is pretty predictable if you think about it. After all, Israel is home to half the world's Jews. Having that many of them in one place is naturally going to draw the anger and attention of the millions of people who despise Jews and want them to disappear. For this reason, anti-Semites are obsessed with Israel, and it's one of the biggest excuses they use to rationalize their prejudice. In many places, it's not respectable to openly hate Jews, but it is respectable to criticize the Jewish state. And so bigots will say their problem is with Israel, when their real problem is with Jews. What does this look like in practice? First, there's the obvious stuff. Around the world, anti-Semites assault Jews and vandalize Jewish schools, synagogues, campus institutions, and even Holocaust memorials over alleged Israeli actions thousands of miles away.
When this began, mid-May, in Gaza and Israel, anti-Semitic incidents in the US spiked. Jewish diners attacked in Los Angeles when a pro-Palestinian motorcade stopped, men got out and
started running toward the tables and asking indiscriminately who's Jewish.
This is just the usual harassment and violence that Jews have experienced for centuries. Israel is simply the flimsy cover story that perpetrators of these crimes invoke to justify their classically anti-Semitic actions. Then you have traditional anti-Semitic lies that are repurposed as anti-Israel lies. For example, back in the Middle Ages, Jews were repeatedly accused of murdering Gentile children for perverse purposes. Some anti-Semites still make this bizarre medieval accusation known as the blood libel today. But others have adapted it for the 21st century, with some twisting it into the claim that Israel is perpetrating genocide against the Palestinian people. In actuality, according to the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, the Palestinian population in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza has skyrocketed since Israel's founding in 1948. Whatever one thinks of Israel, that's obviously the opposite of genocide. This false allegation isn't a legitimate argument. It's a blood libel on a national scale, an ugly update of an ancient slander.
إسرائيل الآن يركز على قتل الأطفال، وأنا أظن أنه هذا شيء مكتنز في العقلية الصهيونية والعقلية اليهودية التاريخية التي أدمنت قتل النساء والأطفال، وكلنا يتذكر كيف كان اليهود يذبحون المسيحيين ليخلطوا دماءهم بفطيرهم المقدس.
This is not the only anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that has received an anti-Israel facelift. Take the mother of all anti-Semitic myths, the idea that Jews secretly run the world. Because it's frowned upon to say that the Jews control the economy or government these days, anti-Semites instead insist that Israel or its Zionist supporters do. Robert Bowers, the white supremacist who massacred Jews at a Pittsburgh synagogue, claimed that Zog, Zionist-occupied government, was in control of America's political parties. So did the supreme leader of Iran. All of these anti-Semitic ideas, rebranded as merely anti-Israel, are revealing in that they just replace the word Jew with Israel or Zionist.
We need to end Zionism, which is huge, and it's probably the biggest problem that we have in this country today and around the globe, which is a few people controlling pretty much everything, all the money, all the business, brainwashing all the people from the education systems, everything.
Israel is losing out. They're losing the media war despite their connections. The tide is turning.
What are their connections?
Deep pockets.
What does that mean?
Well, they're very influential people. I mean, they control media.
Other instances of anti-Jewish prejudice disguising themselves as anti-Israel arguments are more subtle. These often involve the Jewish state being subjected to criticism leveled at no other non-Jewish country. Consider the United Nations, whose Human Rights Council has condemned Israel over 70 times in its 14-year history, more than all other countries combined, including vastly worse regimes like China, North Korea, and Russia.
It is also appalling that the Council has one standing agenda, and that's Israel.
Here is a bit of context that you might not know. The United Nations from 2012 through 2015 has adopted 97 resolutions specifically criticizing an individual country, and of those 97, 83 of them have focused on Israel. Is Israel truly deserving of 86% of the world's condemnation, or possibly is something else afoot?
To be clear, the point here is not that Israel has never committed human rights violations that deserve criticism. It's that Israel's violations deserve to be treated like those of any non-Jewish country, but they are not.
For the simple truth is that for as long as Israel has been a member of this institution, Israel has been treated differently from other nations at the United Nations.
Any unbiased observer understands that this is not because Israel is more evil than all other countries, but because it is more Jewish. This disparate treatment was so egregious that in 2017, the US Senate sent a letter to the UN Secretary General, calling on him to combat the institution's bias against Israel. It was signed by all 100 US senators, from Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio to Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. So what's going on here? Why is Israel, a country that certainly merits reasonable criticisms like any other, attracting so many unreasonable attacks? Here's an analogy that helps untangle this. Criticizing Barack Obama doesn't make someone racist, but as the first black president, he naturally attracted vicious critics motivated by racism. Similarly, criticizing Israel doesn't mean that someone is anti-Semitic, but as the world's only Jewish state, Israel naturally attracts many critics motivated by anti-Semitism. Keep in mind that sometimes a claim can be offensive and wrong without being anti-Semitic. A person might just be repeating something misguided they heard from friends or social media and be speaking from ignorance, not hatred. The inconvenient truth is that there's no simple test for determining whether someone is anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, or just plain anti-Semitic. Anyone who tells you that criticism of Israel or Zionism is always anti-Semitic or never anti-Semitic doesn't seriously understand anti-Semitism. What's important is that we be aware that anti-Semites are drawn to Israel debates, that we are vigilant about rejecting their bigoted baggage, and that we prevent them from corrupting the critical conversation about the Jewish state and its conduct.
Okay, so let's move on. Here we go. So I want to reiterate this. This is a very important point. It was said in the video multiple times, but I want to say it again. Israel as a country can and should be receptive to fair and legitimate criticism, whether the criticism is from its own citizens or from members of the larger global community. If you've been following the news at all over the last 7 months, there's a huge protest movement in Israel right now concerning judicial reforms in the country, and there's been literally hundreds of thousands of people protesting in the streets every single week that are critical of policy, right? Okay, I want to also reiterate the second part, that however, all too often, condemnation of Israel crosses the line from valid criticism into denigration that can be considered anti-Semitic. We learned about that in the video. So I want to give you a little rule of thumb. It's called the 3Ds test, which can help you sort of determine, because sometimes, as it said in the video, it's nuanced, it gets complicated, right? If we say it's always anti-Semitic, there's no way that's true. If we say it's never anti-Semitic, that's also definitely not true. So let's look at these examples here. Demonization, double standards, and delegitimization, right? If you look at this in the context of any other country, criticizing any other country, the same thing really applies. Not necessarily for anti-Semitism, but whether it's racism or, you know, totally disregarding the right of that country to exist. So number one, demonization. When Israel and its leaders are made to seem completely evil, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when Israel and Israelis are equated with Nazi Germany and Nazis, when Israel is seen as the sole cause for the situation in the Middle East, this is considered anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. Number two, double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively and in a grossly unfair manner, and Israel is singled out when clearly immoral behavior of other nation states is ignored. And finally, delegitimization, when Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied among all peoples of the world. So again, I mentioned this word earlier, the Jewish lived experience. This is something that we speak about a lot today. Yeah? Oh, I'm so happy. Thank you. I appreciate that a lot. Okay, there we go. So Jewish lived experience. This is a famous image. Does anybody recognize this image? Have you seen this before? Anyone? Do you know what it's from? No pressure if you don't. Some of the symbols in there. Hands up if you've ever been to Rome before. Nice, that's pretty good. So if you've been to Rome, close to the Colosseum, there's an archaeological site that has a lot of really incredible Roman archaeological artifacts. One of them is called the Arch of Titus. The Arch of Titus. And on the Arch of Titus, which was put together 2,000 years ago, one of the images on this arch is the image you're looking at right now. It's an image of Jewish slaves carrying artifacts, including the menorah, from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which had just been destroyed by the Romans. This is in 70 AD. Carrying artifacts from the Jewish temple towards Rome, where they were then enslaved. Okay? So a lot of people go to these archaeological sites, think, oh, this is incredible, such great history. But you have to understand, when Jewish people see something like this is really a part of one story, right? The Jewish daily prayers, there's 3 prayers a day, and each of those prayers for 2,000 years has prayed to be able to return to Jerusalem and to bring the Jewish people back to their ancestral homeland. So you have to understand, before I go into the next piece, what the anxiety is of the Jewish people, right? A long history of discrimination, of pogroms, of violence, of being the constant scapegoat, being blamed for all of the world's problems. And today, right after 2,000 years, the Jewish people once again have a Jewish state. But even today, that's an amazing thing and miraculous in many ways. But at the same time, there's tension and there's anxiety and trauma with that, because in some places, the Jewish state is only 9 miles wide, and for its 75 years of existence, has basically been at war with all of its neighbors. And that is, you know, a real stress and anxiety that exists amongst many, many Jewish people. So I want to show you, this is a picture here from, this is actually an event at a school in Ottawa, I believe last year. I just want to show the symbol on the right. It says from the river to the sea, with a map and a Palestinian flag, right? So right, I'm sure we have Palestinian students. Students should all be proud of their heritage, should all be proud of their background. Zero question about that. I want to explain from the Jewish perspective, why the image on the right is a stressful, hurtful image for many Jewish people, right? The river refers to the Jordan River, which is the eastern border of all of the land that is Israel and Palestinian territory, right? And the sea refers to the Mediterranean Sea, which is the western border of Israel. And in this image, this isn't calling for a peaceful solution or a two-state solution or for human rights. It has taken the entire state of Israel and covered it in a Palestinian flag, which is sending the message that Israel doesn't exist, or Israel shouldn't have the right to exist. And of course, that's an example of delegitimization, which is a problem, right? You see on the bottom left a picture of a Palestinian flag. It says Free Palestine, right? If Free Palestine depends on when it's being used, the context in which it's being used. If Free Palestine means there shouldn't be a Jewish state, it's a problem. But if it means calling for human rights, calling for a Palestinian state, calling for a peaceful solution, great, wonderful. So I want to show you one more example. This is a minute-long video. This is a Jewish social media influencer who's got nothing to do with Israel. He is a celebrity chef, and he posts recipes online and that kind of thing. He posted a video last year about International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is held every year on January 27th. And I'm going to let him speak for himself in this video.
Commenting Free Palestine on a Jewish person's post is anti-Semitic. Last week I posted a video about the Holocaust, the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews, and received hundreds of comments about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, among other vile anti-Semitic messages. I, like the majority of Jews, support Israel's existence. I'm a proud Zionist, which means I support self-determination and statehood for the Jewish people in our ancestral homeland of Israel. Now, that doesn't imply support for every policy or action of the Israeli government. I'm a proud American, and I don't support every policy or action of our government. Criticizing Israel isn't inherently anti-Semitic. Like any country, Israel is imperfect, and critique with the goal of it doing better is constructive, but calling for the destruction of the only Jewish state on earth is anti-Semitic. Furthermore, bombarding a Jew unaffiliated with Israel's government with anti-Israel commentary is anti-Semitic, just like doing so to a Chinese person about the Chinese government is xenophobic. So let's set the record straight. Commenting Free Palestine on a Jewish person's post is anti-Semitic and does nothing to aid the conflict.
Okay, so to reiterate, this guy had made a post about the Holocaust, zero connection to politics, zero connection to the Middle East, and he was bombarded with thousands of comments that said Free Palestine. We understand that, if it was a post about the conflict, if it was a post about politics, maybe there's context in which that makes sense. But if it's a post something totally separate about the Jewish people, about the Holocaust, about past experiences, and then you're bringing that into it, that's problematic. I want to show you one more example here. Of course, demonization, right? We spoke about delegitimization, demonization, double standards, showing that Nazis are Israelis. Okay, so we've understood the issue here. Hopefully we've understood the issue here. And again, I promise you we're going to share lots of resources that can help you continue to learn about these issues. So let's talk about what really matters here. Let's be practical. Ideas of how we can support Jewish students. Again, I want to reiterate, I believe in your last PD session, right, Matt, that you guys got this fantastic document that essentially shares how to intervene whenever you see actions of hate or racism or xenophobia or whatever it is in your classroom, and how to deal with it, how to respond to it. The same thing here is applicable to Jewish students, right? That document applies to all of our students. And today we're talking about the Jewish story so that you understand where Jewish students are coming from. So a couple ideas to begin with. Number one, underscore that words matter and have consequences. Let's use our words for good. So we need to have a zero tolerance policy for all hate. And of course, today we're speaking about anti-Semitism. So a zero tolerance for anti-Semitism. Hateful speech, as we know, often leads to more hate and leads to violence. So we want to avoid that at all costs. Number two, remind students that anti-Semitism comes from all political ideologies and religions. Right? Unfortunately, anti-Semitic ideas and conspiracy theories exist all over the place, and it's not about the community that it comes from, it's about the ideas that are there, and it's the ideas that we need to fight, and it's the ideas that we need to recognize, and it's the ideas that we need to educate our students about so that they can be aware of using language that's, all-encompassing and supportive and empathetic to their classmates. And number 3, educate students about the roots of anti-Semitism and empower them to recognize these age-old tropes in anti-Semitism today. So ultimately, we as educators and our students, we all need to continue to educate ourselves, because the more that we know, in most cases, the more exposure we have, the better we're going to be in recognizing these and not promoting these ideas and these examples. I want to show you, this is straight from the document that the OCDSB has provided. I really think it's fantastic, and I know that you've had the opportunity to read it already. I believe that today in the second half, you're going to be given a handout again with this document. I really encourage everybody to read this individually and soak in the ideas here. And I want to go through a couple of the points here because I think they're really important. And I think in the second half of today's session, when we're doing case studies, this is your guiding light. This is what you should be using to respond. So number 1, guiding principles. We want to focus on limiting harm to the student who was harmed. We want to address every situation because silence sends a message that it's accepted and is being condoned, and prevent and repair harm. So the 4 key points that this document has is number 1, disrupt. As we were watching the last video, Matt turned to me with the CNN clip and he said that would have been a great opportunity for the anchor to step in and disrupt and say, hold on a second, this is problematic what you're saying, to call it out, right? We need to call out hateful speech. We need to call out anti-Semitism when we see it. We need to check in with the students who can be affected by it. Number 1, educate. Educate, educate. We're educators. We want to educate ourselves. We want to educate our students. We want to teach our students about the history. We want to teach our students about why this is painful, why this is hurtful. Number 3, we want to support. We want to check in with our Jewish students. We want to check in with students who are impacted by hateful speech. And finally, we want to report it as well. We want to make sure that the proper people know about this so that we can plan accordingly and make sure that these things aren't happening going forward. Okay, I just want to show you 2 quick slides of resources just to get you excited for your further learning. I've spoken about a lot of things so far this morning. I want to show you 2 slides that show a number of videos that we've created that touch on these topics that you can access yourselves on Unpacked for Educators or just on YouTube, right? So there's videos, why is anti-Semitism still around? Whose fault is it, which we watched today? Is criticizing Israel anti-Semitic? And other questions. We also have a number of videos on the following anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, right? Ashkenazi Jews and the Kesar theory. I wish we had more time. I could go into that. Are Jews rich? Are Jews white? Were Jews expelled from 109 countries? Are Jewish noses a real thing? The origins of anti-Semitic stereotypes, and much, much more. So just so you know, right, we're not just giving you this small little tidbit and then you go off on your way. You have access to all of these resources to continue that learning.